Have you ever said something in English that was grammatically correct, but the other person still looked a little surprised? Maybe they thought you sounded too direct, too confident, or even a little rude. If that has happened to you, don't worry, because you're definitely not the only one. I recently met an English learner who walked into a cafe and said, "Give me a coffee." The grammar was correct. Every word was in the right place, but the barista's expression immediately changed.
The learner wasn't trying to be impolite at all. In fact, they were simply translating directly from their first language. What they didn't realize was that one small change could have made the request sound warm, friendly, and completely natural.
And that's exactly what today's episode is all about. The problem wasn't grammar. It wasn't pronunciation either. The real problem was choosing the wrong modal verb. Native English speakers use modal verbs every single day to make requests sound polite, give advice without sounding bossy, and express possibility without sounding uncertain. They're small words, but they completely change how your message is received.
Today, we're not going to memorize long grammar rules or study complicated charts. Instead, we're going to solve 3 everyday communication problems that almost every English learner faces. First, you'll learn how to sound more polite when asking for something. Then, we'll explore how to give advice naturally. Finally, we'll show you how to talk about possibility and certainty like a confident English speaker.
By the end of this episode, you'll know exactly which modal verb to choose in 3 everyday situations that confuse millions of English learners. And to make sure everything sticks, we'll finish with a natural conversation where you'll hear all of these modal verbs used in real life.
Before we begin, make sure you subscribe to Native English Podcast so you never miss an episode. Now, let's discover how a few small words can make a huge difference in the way you speak English.
Exactly, but before we jump into our first communication problem, there's an important question to answer. Why do modal verbs feel so confusing, even for learners who have studied English for years?
I think it's because many learners meet modal verbs in grammar books before they meet them in real conversations. They memorize lists like can is for ability, should is for advice, may is for permission. Those definitions are useful, but they only tell part of the story.
Exactly. Imagine learning how to drive by reading the instruction manual without ever getting behind the wheel. You might understand what each button does, but that doesn't mean you'll feel comfortable driving in traffic. Language works the same way. Knowing the definition of a modal verb doesn't automatically tell you when it sounds natural to use it.
That's why 2 sentences can both be grammatically correct but leave completely different impressions. The words are almost identical, yet one sounds friendly and respectful while the other feels too direct. Sometimes changing just one modal verb is enough to change the tone of an entire conversation.
Native speakers rarely stop and think, "I'm going to use a modal verb now." They choose the expression that fits the situation. The decision happens naturally because they've heard those patterns thousands of times in everyday life.
That's also why translating directly from your first language can create problems. You might know the vocabulary you want to use, but if you choose the wrong modal verb, your intention and your message don't always match. You want to sound helpful, but you sound demanding. You want to sound confident, but you sound uncertain.
So, throughout this episode, we're going to learn differently. Instead of organizing everything around grammar rules, we'll organize everything around real communication. Every modal verb you hear today will solve a practical problem that you could face at work, while traveling, with friends, or in everyday conversations.
Once you connect modal verbs with real situations instead of isolated definitions, they become much easier to remember because you're learning when people actually use them, not just what they mean.
So, shall we begin with the first and probably the most common problem?
Of course. Let's understand the first problem with the help of a situation almost everyone experiences. You're standing in a coffee shop ready to order your favorite drink. You could simply say, "I want a cappuccino." The employee will probably understand you, but it sounds a little abrupt because you're stating what you want instead of making a request.
A much more natural choice is, "Can I have a cappuccino, please?" That's how many native speakers order food and drinks every day. The word can turns a simple statement into a polite request.
Now, suppose you're having dinner at an elegant restaurant or speaking to someone you've never met before. In those situations, many people naturally choose a different modal verb. They say, "Could I have a cappuccino, please?"
The meaning hasn't changed at all. You're still asking for the same drink. The difference is the tone. Could makes your request sound softer and a little more respectful. That's why it's so common in formal situations or whenever you want to be especially courteous.
So don't think of can and could as competitors. Think of them as choices. Can is perfect for everyday conversations, while could adds an extra level of politeness when the situation calls for it.
Let's look at another everyday situation. You're working on an important project and you'd like a coworker to check your presentation before the meeting. You could ask, "Can you take a look at these slides?" It's friendly, natural, and something you'll hear in offices every day.
But if the person is busy or you're asking someone you don't know very well, you might say, "Could you take a look at these slides when you have a moment?" It sounds more thoughtful because you're recognizing that the other person may not be available immediately.
That's an important point. Using could doesn't mean you're doubting someone's ability. You're simply making your request sound less direct.
Now let's introduce another modal verb that native speakers use constantly, especially in professional situations. That's would.
Listen to these two questions. Could you explain this report? Now compare it with, would you explain this report to me? Both are polite, but would often sounds a little more formal and a little more considerate. That's why you'll hear it frequently in meetings, interviews, customer service, and business emails.
Here's another example. You're sitting in class, but you didn't catch what your teacher just said. Instead of saying, "Repeat that," you naturally ask, "Could you repeat that, please?" It's a simple change, but it makes your request sound much more respectful.
Now, picture yourself at a conference. The speaker has just shared an interesting idea, but one part wasn't completely clear. After the presentation, you walk over and ask, "Would you mind explaining that last point again?" Most native speakers immediately recognize that as a very polite request.
Let's try one final situation. You're exploring a city you've never visited before and suddenly realize you're lost. You stop someone on the street and ask, "Excuse me, could you tell me how to get to the train station?" That sounds warm, respectful, and completely natural.
Compare that with saying, "Tell me how to get to the train station." The grammar isn't wrong, but the tone is very different. It sounds more like an instruction than a request, and that's the difference modal verbs can make.
So, here's an easy way to remember everything we've learned. Use can for friendly, everyday requests. Choose could when you want to sound a little more polite, and use would when you're speaking in more formal situations or when you want your request to sound especially considerate.
Once you start choosing modal verbs based on the situation instead of translating directly from your first language, people won't just understand your English, they'll notice that it sounds more natural, more confident, and much more pleasant to listen to.
Being polite is an important communication skill, but there are times when you need to do more than make a polite request. Sometimes you need to help someone make a better decision.
And that's exactly what we'll learn next, because being polite is important, but knowing how to help someone or guide them is just as important. Think about how often people ask for advice. A friend can't decide whether to change jobs. A classmate is struggling with exams. Someone wants recommendations before traveling abroad. These conversations happen every day, and they're the perfect opportunity to use modal verbs naturally.
The good news is that English gives us a simple way to offer advice without sounding like we're giving orders. The modal verb you'll hear most often is should.
Imagine your friend tells you, "I've been sleeping only 4 hours a night because I'm studying."
You probably wouldn't respond by saying, sleep 8 hours. That sounds more like a command.
Instead, you'd naturally say, "You should get more sleep." It feels supportive rather than controlling.
That's the key idea. Should expresses a recommendation. You're sharing what you think is a good idea, but you're still leaving the final decision to the other person.
Let's try another example. Your younger brother says he's always forgetting his homework.
A natural response would be, you should make a checklist before you leave home. It's practical advice, and it sounds encouraging instead of critical.
Here's one more example from the workplace. A coworker says, "I have an important presentation tomorrow and I'm really nervous."
You might reply, you should practice it a few more times tonight. Again, you're offering guidance, not giving an order.
Now let's introduce another expression that learners often see but don't use very much. That's ought to.
The meaning is very similar to should. If I say, you ought to practice before the presentation, the advice is almost the same.
So why don't we hear ought to as often?
Simply because should is more common in everyday conversation. Native speakers usually choose should because it's shorter and more natural in casual situations. However, ought to still appears in conversations, especially when someone wants to sound a little more thoughtful or when they're emphasizing that something is the right thing to do.
Okay, let's compare them. A friend says, "I'm always tired." You could answer, "You should go to bed earlier." Or you could say, "You ought to go to bed earlier."
Both sound correct. The second one feels slightly more formal, but neither sentence is wrong.
Here's a mistake that many learners make. They hear the word should and think it means the same as must.
But there's a big difference. If I say, you must finish this report today, it sounds like an obligation.
If I say, "You should finish this report today," I'm simply giving advice. I'm suggesting what I believe is the best choice.
Exactly. That's what makes should and ought to so useful. They allow you to share your opinion in a way that feels friendly, respectful, and supportive.
And once you become comfortable using them, you'll notice that conversations with friends, coworkers, and even strangers feel much more natural because you're giving advice the way native speakers usually do.
I think now we should move to today's final group of modal verbs. In the next group, we'll look at may, might, and must. They all help us express uncertainty or certainty, but they don't all mean the same thing.
Let's begin with may. Imagine you're planning a picnic for tomorrow. You check the forecast and it looks like there's a chance of rain. You might say, "It may rain tomorrow." You're not saying it definitely will rain, you're simply saying it's a real possibility.
Now compare that with might. Suppose the forecast isn't very clear and the weather keeps changing. You could say, it might rain tomorrow. In everyday English, may and might are often very close in meaning, but might usually suggests a little more uncertainty.
So here's a simple way to remember them. May means something is possible. Might means it's possible too, but you're a little less certain.
Now let's move to a completely different idea. Imagine you're getting ready to leave the house, but you can't find your keys anywhere.
You look around the living room and say, "I may have left them on the table."
A few seconds later, you remember carrying some groceries into the kitchen, so you say, I might have left them on the kitchen counter.
Notice what we're doing. We're making educated guesses because we don't know the answer yet.
But what if the evidence points very strongly in one direction? That's when we often use must.
Imagine your friend usually arrives 10 minutes early, but today they're 30 minutes late. You call them several times, but they don't answer.
Instead of saying they are busy, you naturally say they must be busy. You're not talking about obligation here. You're making a logical conclusion based on the information you have.
Here's another example. You're waiting at the airport and the departure board suddenly shows a 1-hour delay.
You could say, the weather may be causing delays.
Then you notice that every flight leaving the airport is delayed.
At that point, you might say, there must be a major weather problem. You're no longer making a random guess, you're reaching a conclusion because the evidence supports it. Remember that understanding the pattern is important. Once you understand that pattern, you'll find it much easier to express your thoughts naturally, instead of sounding either too certain or too unsure.
Before we finish today's episode, let's see how much you've remembered. Don't worry, this isn't a test. Think of it as a quick challenge to help you build confidence. I'll describe a situation, and before Max gives the answer, see if you can choose the best modal verb.
Great idea. If you can answer these correctly, you'll know you're already using today's lesson in real-life situations.
Here's the first one. You're meeting your professor after class, and you want them to explain something one more time. Which modal verb would make your request sound the most polite?
If you chose could, you're absolutely right. You could say, could you explain that again, please? It's respectful, natural, and perfect for that situation.
Now, imagine your best friend tells you they've been eating unhealthy food every day and they're feeling tired all the time. What would you say?
The best choice is should. You should eat more balanced meals. You're giving friendly advice, not telling your friend what they have to do.
Here's another one. You're planning a beach trip this weekend, but the forecast isn't completely clear. You aren't sure if it will rain. Which modal verb fits best?
Both may and might work, but if you're expressing a little more uncertainty, you could say, it might rain this weekend.
Let's make it a little more challenging. You arrive at your colleague's office and their computer is on, their notebook is open, and you can hear someone talking inside the meeting room. What would you say?
In that case, the best answer is must. She must be in a meeting. You're making a logical conclusion based on the evidence around you.
Last question. You're writing an email to a client and you'd like them to review a document before tomorrow. Which modal verb would make your request sound professional and considerate?
I'd choose would. You could write, would you have a chance to review the document before tomorrow? It sounds courteous and fits a professional setting very well.
If you answered most of those correctly, that's fantastic. And if you missed one or two, don't worry. Learning a language isn't about getting everything perfect the first time. It's about noticing patterns and using them a little more confidently every day.
Exactly. The more you hear these modal verbs in real conversations and the more you use them yourself, the more natural they'll become. Let's finish with one simple takeaway. Today, we didn't try to learn every modal verb in English. Instead, we focused on 3 communication skills that you'll use almost every day. First, we learned how can, could, and would help you make polite requests. Then we explored how should and ought to let you give advice in a friendly, supportive way. Finally, we saw how may, might, and must help you talk about possibility and logical certainty.
By the way, which of today's 3 communication skills do you find the most challenging? Making polite requests, giving advice, or expressing possibility? Let us know in the comments and try writing one example sentence using a modal verb you've learned today. We'd also love to hear from you.
If you enjoyed this episode and found it helpful, don't forget to follow the Native English podcast and share it with someone who's learning English. Every episode is designed to help you speak with more confidence through practical, everyday conversations.
Thanks for spending your time with us today. We'll see you in the next episode. Until then, take care and keep speaking English every day.